Hey there, Michael Kuhlman here. It's a rainy day here in Altamont Springs, Florida. Um, Thanks for clicking on the video. The clip you're about to watch is part of actually like an hour and 40 long minute video that I kind of put together where I reviewed a bunch of other books and authors, the books off my shelf. So if you're interested in this clip, check out that larger video. Thank you for clicking on the video. We'll talk about another series. This series is super huge. I've been reading these for years. And this is Steve Erikson's The Malazan Book of the Fallen. So these are the first 4 books. The reason I show you this is because I am reading this one, House of Chains. You can see actually my mark right there. So about halfway through it. I put these books down because these books are kind of a slog to get through. They're really good, but they are... It's like he's an anthropologist, and he was a professor, I believe, and he just started writing. He had a D&D campaign with his friends. So much of this comes down to D&D. I don't know why. I'm not a big D&D player. I played World of Darkness growing up, but then not whatever. I mean, it's fantasy and sci-fi, so you can't get away from it. This is the first book in the series called Gardens of the Moon. Amazing. You don't get attached to any character. It's a little bit like Game of Thrones, where it's not like everyone's dying all the time, but the whole series is... He introduces dozens of new characters in each of the books, and the books take place on different continents. It's all fantasy, so it's there's magic, and it's years and years and years ago, and it's there's not a main character, which I would say is a criticism of these books, but the way he writes it is he introduces a character. You get to know the character, and the character is very impersonal. You're not inside their thoughts. You are just... It's just like a camera is following and telling what they're doing. It's not a whole lot of internal dialogue. So like they follow a mage, and in the very first couple chapters, and I thought it was like... I was really attached to this character. I was getting into it. I was like, okay, I'm starting to get the way that she operates and the way she goes through the world. And then kind of halfway through the book, we don't really mention that character a whole lot. Mentioned a few other times, and then never again. Like, almost never. Like, that character, I forget her name. I don't, who cares about the details, but sort of mentioned, like, in the 3rd book, but... It's like very surprising. I was like, well, what happened to our character? We're just learning new ones. It's always like we're learning about new characters as opposed to sticking with wrapping up the story of the old characters. And it's actually kind of cool because it's reflective of sort of how real life operates, that what he's trying to tell is a history of the Malazan Empire. And so the Malazans are this, and nobody's good or bad or evil. Like, it's not clear. Everyone does good things and bad things, and there's some characters you like because they're a little bit better than others, and there's some that just seem not evil or bad, but just they're I see why they're doing this. Like, there's one really gruff character in the 4th book, the newest book that I'm there's 10 books total, but the one I'm reading, and he seems to be doing lots of gruff stuff, but he's just kind of like almost like a barbarian, and he comes from a very like half ogre tribe, and those people he doesn't view human life as important, and so he just kills lots of people a lot. But that's, if you follow the character and how he grew up in his tribe, like, this is how he should operate, this is how he should do things. So it's kind of interesting in that way. A lot of these books in this first book is really interesting. The hook that gets everybody in, it got me in, was a floating fortress comes down and interrupts a battle that the Malazan Empire is trying to take over a city, and the Malazan Empire now has to focus its attention on this floating fortress that's run by this... not a human, it's like a non-human race. Like, they're sort of like high elves is how I think about them. It's really difficult to imagine what all the races look like. Like there's an undead race, but there's 3 different types of undead. They're like skeletons that they can travel through the ground, and they turn into dust, and they're thousands of years old. And some of them can cast magic. And then there's another race that's like high elves and then there's another one that's like dark elves, that they sort of are very tall and have like blue skin or dark skin, but then piercing white eyes, and like white hair. And so the leader of, I forget what his name is, but the leader of this like comes down and tries to make a truce with people, but he's very political, and so he's playing both sides off each other. And all this happens. It follows generals in the of the Malazan army, but it follows different. Like Whiskey Jack is the leader of the army. It's like the 37th Brigade or something, and so it follows just his troop, just his small group of, I don't know, like 20 or 30 people. And so they're sort of they represent the Empire, but they're not, like, they do their own thing, and they're trying to play the politics game with the mages. And the mage finds herself in a situation that's very different from like she casts a spell or something, and she gets sucked into an alternate dimension, and then 2 books later, she pops out on a different continent, and then she's part of a puppet. Like, she becomes, like, attached to a puppet, and then a different mage has her carried around. Yeah, I know I'm getting some details wrong. If you guys have read the books, I'm totally butchering it, but I'm trying to communicate what I remember about it and why I liked it and what the interesting part about these books are. I mean, they're just radical and crazy, and they're just so methodical, and like it's like reading a history book of another civilization. It's really in-depth world building. I mean, no movie can get close to the amount of detail that's written in just this first book, which I liked. What I think it's the best so far. I mean, maybe the second book might have been better, but books 3 and 4 have been much longer, much more broad in their scope, and much harder to follow for me. So that's the first one, is Gardens of the Moon. Takes place on the continent Genebakis, and outlines the Malazans trying to take over a city. The city is called Pale, I believe. Let me read you the description. I think that'll be helpful in this, because this is such a great series. So, the Malazan Empire simmers with discontent, bled dry by interminable warfare, bitter infighting, and bloody confrontations. Even the Imperial legions, long inured to the bloodshed, yearn for some respite. Yet Empress Lacine's rule remains absolute, enforced by her dread claw assassins. For Sergeant Whiskey Jack and his squad of bridge burners, and for Tattersail, surviving cadre mage of the 2nd Legion, the aftermath of the Siege of Pale should have been a time to mourn the many dead. But Darujistan, which is the new city that they're trying to take over throughout the course of this book, last of the free cities of Genebakis, yet holds out. It is to this ancient citadel that Lacine turns her predatory glaze. But it would appear that the Empire is not alone in this great game. Sinister, shadow-bound forces are gathering as the gods themselves prepare to play their hand. And that last point is an important point too, is that they have a whole set of gods that interferes somewhat with the world. And so most of this takes place in the humans and the other races and their fightings and dealings with each other, but then other races have access to higher orders of gods. And so like the god of death and the god of chance come down to the world, and they open up a gate, and like one character gets killed. He's he's a prince or something, and he gets killed, and he has to go through the god of, I believe it's the god of chance, or maybe the god of death, and he has a dialogue, a discussion, and then he ends up coming out, and now he's the prince of death, and so he's sort of lined up with that, and that was really interesting, and so his character has significance later on, and there's a rich history, like thousands of years, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years old, that they tell the certain gods that are sort of myths, that what they do and how it affected people, and curses that they set that show up thousands of years later into the story now, and they give you that background so that you have of what occurred now. And so if you're trying to read a book like this or a series like this, it is going to take you years, and it's really in depth, and it's worth it. I mean, it's good, but you got to have some time. That is just the first book. The second book is Deadhouse Gates, which takes place on another continent, and it revolves around. Let me read it and then say a few more words on it. So, in the vast dominion of 7 cities, in the holy desert Araku, the seer Shaik and her followers prepare for the long prophesied uprising known as the Whirlwind. Unprecedented in size and savagery, this maelstrom of fanaticism and bloodlust will embroil the Malazan Empire in one of the bloodiest conflicts it has ever known, shaping destinies and giving birth to legends. Set in a brilliantly realized world ravaged by dark, uncontrollable magic, this thrilling novel of war, intrigue, and betrayal confirms Steve Erikson as a storyteller of breathtaking skill, imagination, and originality, a new master of epic fantasy. It follows a leader of an army who's been recruited by the Malazan Empire to travel around and fight them off. And the way they take over new cities, there's kind of like 4 instances in this large book, 828 pages, and there's kind of 200 pages dedicated to each campaign in the army. And it's really interesting, like battlefield tactics, and of course they follow characters that are outside the circle related to the army, but they have different ways of viewing. Some are for it, some are against it. There's one guy from the first book who travels across the sea to this continent, and this takes place after the events of the first one, like pretty immediately after. And this one character is going around, but he has different, like he has to deliver a book of the dead to a different group of people, and that causes a big significant thing to happen, which I still don't know about, but that's going to have events later on. I read a little bit about it online, and so that's kind of cool. And then they had a girl was put into mines. She was punished for something, and she becomes this seer and the leader of that undead race from that I've already described. And so she has a follower, and then I think that turns out that the Empress Lysine put her claws, which are her bodyguards, to protect this girl because she's going to become the leader of the rebellion. And so the Empress is sort of playing both sides of her army and then the rebellion against the army on each continent. And it's very mysterious and hard to put together, but that's that book. I enjoyed the second book. I don't know if I enjoyed the first one or the second one more, but they were both great. The third book, I don't remember much of because I didn't like it that much. If you guys skip through this if you don't like it. I mean, if you're listening, then you're enjoying it. I'll read off the back of the third book. The ravaged continent of Genebacus. So they went back to the first continent from the first book, and that was kind of cool because the second book and the third book, I believe, take place at the same time, which are both after the events of the first book. So we're going back to the first continent. The ravaged continent of Genebacus has given birth to a terrifying new empire, the Panian Domin. Oh yeah, I do remember this. Like a tide of corrupted blood, it seethers across the land, devouring all. In its path stands an uneasy alliance. One Arm's army and Whiskey Jack's bridge burners alongside their enemies of old, the forces of the warlord Kaladin brood, Anomander Rake and his Tisti Andi mages, and the Revi people of the plains. But ancient undead clans are also gathering. The Tlan Imas, which are the undead people, have risen, for it would seem something altogether darker and more malign threatens this world. Rumors around that the crippled god is now unchained and intent on a terrible revenge. So somewhere in the first two books, the crippled god, which is this super uber powerful god, was unchained, and so I think that's the culmination at the end of book 10 that is the big thing that they're all going towards. Marking the return of many characters from Gardens of the Moon, the first book, and introducing a host of remarkable new players, Memories of Ice is both a momentous new chapter in Steven Erikson's magnificent epic fantasy and a triumph of storytelling. I didn't enjoy this one as much because it was just too long. It was 920 pages, but worth reading because it's just an epic and it's great. And I actually am enjoying the fourth one. The fourth one, House of Chains, this one's been great so far. Haven't read it in about a year and a half. Like, I mean, that marker's probably been there for a year. Because it's so long, it's so dense. There's a lot of, just the mechanics of reading these types of books is you have long stretches where it's a lot of information but not a lot happening. And then we switch characters, and it's like, I don't have faith that we're going to resolve that in this book or in the next, like, if I'm reading this over the course of a year of my life, I'm not sure I'll get to the end of that in 4 months. So am I going to remember it? So it's sort of hard to stick to it, if that makes sense. I'm going to have a tough time rereading this. As I'm talking about it, it makes me want to read it, like continue on. I'm going to have a tough time remembering what's already happened in the first half when I resume for the second half. And so there's resources online that you can use to read. I did that before I started this book because I took a break between books 3 and this one, 4. And reading the wiki, you absolutely should read the books first, but then reading the wiki reminds me of all the things that happened. Yeah. This one has been interesting because I love the main character. He turns out to be a really impactful character, and his name is Karsa Orlong. I believe that, yeah. And that's the half-ogre guy that I mentioned. So, let's read it. In northern Genebakis, a raiding party of savage tribal warriors descends from the mountains into the southern flatlands. Their intention is to wreak havoc amongst the despised lowlanders. But for the one named Karsa Orlong, it marks the beginning of what will prove to be an extraordinary destiny. Some years later, it is the aftermath of the Chain of Dogs. That's from Book 2. Tavori, the adjunct to the Empress, has arrived in the last remaining Malazan stronghold of 7 cities. New to command, she must hone 12,000 soldiers, mostly raw recruits, but for a handful of veterans of Coltane's legendary march, into a force capable of challenging the massed hordes of the Shaiks whirlwind who lie in wait in the heart of the holy desert. But waiting is never easy. The Seer's warlords are locked into a power struggle that threatens the very soul of the rebellion, while Shaik herself suffers, haunted by the knowledge of her nemesis, her own sister, Tavore. And so begins this awesome new chapter in Steven Erikson's acclaimed Malazan Book of the Fallen. All right. And then once I keep going with these, I'd love to talk about it more and discuss it. So that's halfway through the 4th one.